Imagine waking up every morning to the sound of your own coughing, not the gentle clearing of a throat, but the harsh metallic hack of lungs filled with iron dust and coal smoke. Your hands, permanently stained black with soot and scarred from countless burns, ache before you even rise from your straw mattress. The smell of sulfur and charcoal has become so embedded in your skin that your own children recoil from your embrace. This was the reality for medieval blacksmiths, craftsmen whose very livelihood slowly killed them with every swing of the hammer. The romantic image of the village blacksmith, strong, respected, essential to his community, couldn't be further from the brutal truth. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, lived lives of constant physical torment, social isolation, and economic uncertainty. They breathed poison daily, suffered injuries that would shock modern emergency room doctors, and died decades before their peers, all while society simultaneously depended on them and kept them at arm's length. To understand why being a medieval blacksmith was one of history's most punishing professions, we must first grasp what these craftsmen actually faced each day. The medieval forge wasn't just a workplace, it was a torture chamber where men voluntarily sentenced themselves to slow, agonizing deaths in exchange for the meager coins that kept their families fed. The blacksmith's day began before dawn, not by choice but by necessity. The forge needed time to reach proper temperature, and in a world without electric lighting, every hour of daylight was precious. Picture Thomas the Smith, rising in the pitch darkness of a January morning in 1347. His small workshop, attached to his equally small home, offers no insulation from the bitter cold. The walls, built of rough stone and sealed with mud and straw, leak frigid air through countless gaps. His breath forms clouds in the darkness as he fumbles for his flint and steel. But starting the fire was just the beginning of his suffering. Medieval charcoal burned dirty and produced thick, acrid smoke that filled the workshop within minutes. Without proper ventilation, a luxury beyond the means of most smiths, this smoke had nowhere to go. Thomas would spend the next 12 to 14 hours breathing this toxic mixture, his lungs gradually accumulating the carbon particles and metallic dust that would eventually kill him. The heat itself presented another form of torture. Medieval forges reached temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt copper and make iron malleable. Standing inches from this inferno for hours on end, Thomas's face would burn and blister. The radiant heat dried out his eyes, cracked his lips, and turned his skin leather tough and permanently flushed. In summer, the combination of external heat and forge fire created conditions so extreme that many smiths worked shirtless, exposing their torsos to constant burns from flying sparks and hot metal fragments, yet Thomas couldn't step away from the fire. Iron and steel wait for no man. They must be worked while hot or become useless. A piece of metal that cooled too much meant wasted fuel, wasted time, and wasted materials. In an economy where a pound of iron cost more than a week's wages for a common laborer, waste meant poverty or starvation. The physical demands of the work destroyed men's bodies with mechanical precision. Every piece of iron required hundreds, sometimes thousands of hammer blows to shape properly. A single horseshoe might demand 500 strikes. A sword could require over 10,000. Each blow sent shock waves up the smith's arms, gradually destroying the joints in his wrists, elbows, and shoulders. By age 40, most smiths suffered from what we now recognize as severe arthritis and repetitive stress injuries. Thomas's hammer weighed between 2 and 4 pounds, not exceptionally heavy for a single lift, but devastating when swung thousands of times daily. His right arm, doing most of the work, would become grotesquely overdeveloped compared to his left. His grip strength, essential for controlling the hammer, would gradually diminish as the constant impacts damaged the small bones. In his hands, many veteran smiths developed a distinctive tremor, their hands shaking uncontrollably even at rest. The workshop itself was a minefield of hazards that would horrify modern safety inspectors. Sharp metal fragments littered the floor, ready to slice through the thin leather shoes that were all most smiths could afford. Hot coals frequently fell from the forge, creating fire hazards and burning anything they touched. The quenching tub, filled with water or oil for cooling hot metal, became contaminated with rust, scale, and worse. Many smiths used urine for quenching certain metals, as the ammonia provided specific chemical properties. The smell alone was overwhelming. Burns were not occasional accidents, but daily occurrences. Thomas's arms bore dozens of scars from hot metal that had touched his skin for just an instant. His leather apron, if he could afford one, would be burned through in multiple places. Sparks flew constantly, landing on his hair, his clothes, his exposed skin. Most smiths' eyebrows and eyelashes were permanently singed short. Many suffered burns so severe that they developed what medieval medical texts described as fire rot, infected wounds that never properly healed. The constant noise damaged their hearing with relentless efficiency. The ring of hammer on anvil, repeated thousands of times daily, gradually destroyed the delicate structures of the inner ear. Veteran smiths often became partially or completely deaf, isolated from their communities by their inability to hear conversations. This hearing loss wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. A smith who couldn't hear warning shouts might not notice a fire spreading, a piece of hot metal falling, or a customer approaching the dangerous forge area. Medieval medicine offered no relief for these occupational hazards. There were no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, no ergonomic studies. If a smith injured himself severely enough to be unable to work, he faced immediate poverty. Most communities had no social safety net beyond the uncertain charity of the church. A disabled smith became a burden on his family and community, often ending his days begging on the street. The respiratory damage from constant smoke inhalation created a slow, agonizing death sentence. Medieval smiths universally developed what they called black lung, or smith's cough, conditions we now understand as pneumoconiosis, silicosis, and various forms of lung cancer. Their sputum turned black from the accumulated soot and metal particles. They gasped for breath after mild exertion. Many died, drowning in their own fluids as their damaged lungs filled with blood and pus. Consider the case of William the Smith of Norwich, whose death in 1398 was recorded in unusual detail by a local monk. William had worked his forge for 32 years, beginning as an apprentice at age 14. By his death at 46, he weighed barely 90 pounds, his body ravaged by the constant assault of his profession. The monk wrote that William's final months were spent gasping like a landed fish, his breath rattling like stones in a bag. His family could do nothing but watch as he slowly suffocated, his lungs finally overwhelmed by decades of abuse. But the physical suffering was only part of the blacksmith's burden. The social isolation was equally devastating. Medieval society viewed smiths with a complex mixture of need, fear, and revulsion. They were essential. No community could survive without metal tools, horseshoes, nails, and weapons. Yet, they were also outsiders, practitioners of what many considered a dark and dangerous craft. The association with fire and metal gave smiths an almost supernatural reputation. In a deeply Christian society, fire was associated with hell and damnation. The smith's ability to shape metal with flame seemed to many like a form of sorcery. This superstition was reinforced by the guild secrets that smiths guarded jealously. The exact temperature needed for different metals, the proper quenching techniques, the recipes for various alloys, these were closely guarded mysteries that smiths passed down only to their apprentices and sons. Churches often refused to allow smiths to work on Sundays. not just for religious reasons but because the noise and smoke were considered disruptive to worship. Many communities required smiths to locate their forges on the outskirts of town, partly for fire safety, but also to minimize the noise, smell, and smoke that bothered other residents. This physical separation reinforced the social isolation that smiths experienced. The smell was perhaps the most immediate barrier to social acceptance. Medieval people were accustomed to strong odors, bathing was infrequent, and sanitation was primitive by modern standards. But the smith's particular cocktail of burning coal, hot metal, quenching oil, and his own sweat-soaked body created an odor so distinctive and overwhelming that people could identify a smith from yards away. Tavern keepers often refused to serve smiths, claiming their smell drove away other customers. Even churches sometimes seated smiths in separate sections to avoid offending other worshippers. Marriage prospects for smiths were limited and complicated. While the profession offered more economic security than common laborers enjoyed, the physical demands and social stigma made smiths less desirable as husbands. Women worried about the constant danger their husbands faced, the health problems they would inevitably develop, and the social isolation their families would endure. Many smiths married later in life or remained bachelors entirely. Those who did marry often found their family relationships strained by the demands of the profession. The long hours, the physical exhaustion, and the health problems created distant, difficult fathers and husbands. Children of smiths often grew up largely without their father's presence, despite living and working in the same building. The constant noise made normal conversation difficult, and the smith's declining health as he aged created additional family stress. Economic pressures added another layer of misery to the blacksmith's existence. While smiths earned more than common laborers, their expenses were also significantly higher. They needed to purchase fuel, raw materials, and specialized tools. A good anvil could cost more than a small house. Quality iron was expensive and often difficult to obtain. During times of war, military demand for weapons and armor could make raw materials prohibitively expensive or entirely unavailable. The guild system, while providing some protection and training, also restricted smiths' economic freedom. Guildie rules dictated what a smith could make, how much he could charge, where he could sell his goods, and whom he could train as an apprentice. These regulations were designed to prevent competition and maintain quality standards, but they also prevented smiths from adapting to market changes or improving their economic situation through innovation. Competition was fierce and sometimes violent. A village might support only one or two smiths, making each new arrival a direct threat to established craftsmen's livelihoods. Guild wars between smiths were not uncommon, sometimes escalating to actual violence. The technical knowledge required to be a successful smith took years to acquire, but the market for their services was limited and often seasonal. Seasonal variations in demand created additional economic stress. Spring brought increased demand for farming tools and horseshoes as agricultural work resumed. Summer and fall were busy with harvest preparations and military campaigns, but winter often brought weeks or months of reduced work, when smiths struggled to pay for the fuel needed to keep their forges operational while earning little income. The apprenticeship system, while necessary for training new smiths, created its own forms of suffering. Boys as young as 10 or 12 were bound to mastersmiths for periods of 7 to 14 years. During this time, they received minimal food, clothing, and shelter in exchange for backbreaking labor. Many apprentices were essentially slaves, working 16-hour days while learning skills that would eventually allow them to face the same hardships as their masters. Apprentices faced all the same health hazards as full smiths, but with even less protection. They typically handled the most dangerous tasks, tending the fire, carrying hot metal, operating the bellows. Their smaller bodies were even more vulnerable to heat, smoke, and physical injury. Many apprentices died before completing their training, victims of burns, smoke inhalation, or accidents with heavy machinery. The relationship between master and apprentice was often abusive. Masters had absolute authority over their apprentices, including the right to beat them for perceived laziness or mistakes. Some masters deliberately withheld important technical knowledge to extend the apprenticeship period, ensuring cheap labor for as long as possible. Apprentices had little recourse against abusive masters, as guild rules strongly favored established craftsmen over trainees. Sexual abuse of apprentices was common and rarely punished. Young boys living in their masters' homes dependent on them for food and shelter were particularly vulnerable. Guild records from various European cities contain scattered references to such abuse, though the full extent was certainly much greater than what was formally recorded. Even successful completion of an apprenticeship didn't guarantee a better life. New journeymen smiths faced years of traveling from town to town, seeking work wherever they could find it. They owned no tools, no forge, no anvil. Everything they needed to practice their craft belonged to the masters who employed them. Many journeymen never accumulated enough capital to establish their own shops, remaining wage laborers for their entire careers. The tools of the trade were both essential and dangerous. The basic smith's hammer, while simple in appearance, required precise balance and weight distribution to be effective. Poor quality hammers could break during use, sending sharp metal fragments flying at high speed. The handles, typically made of wood, would loosen or break with repeated heavy use, creating immediate danger for the smith and anyone nearby. Anvils, the most expensive and important tool in any forge, were themselves sources of constant hazard. The repeated hammering gradually cracked even the best anvils, creating weak points that could cause them to shatter explosively. A collapsing anvil could crush a smith's foot or leg, creating injuries that were almost always permanently disabling in an era before effective medical treatment. The bellows, used to force air into the forge and increase the fire's heat, required constant maintenance and operation. Apprentices typically worked the bellows by hand, an exhausting task that had to be precisely timed with the smith's work. Poorly maintained bellows could fail at critical moments, ruining work in progress and wasting expensive materials. Tongs, for handling hot metal, came in dozens of specialized shapes and sizes, each designed for specific tasks. But even the best tongs could slip, dropping red-hot metal onto the smith's feet or legs. Many smiths bore permanent scars from such accidents. The constant gripping and twisting motions required to use tongs effectively caused severe arthritis in the hands and wrists. The quenching process, essential for hardening steel, presented its own unique dangers. Plunging red-hot metal into water or oil created violent steam explosions that could blind or severely burn anyone nearby. The sudden temperature change sometimes caused metal to crack explosively, sending sharp fragments in all directions. Oil quenching was particularly dangerous as the hot oil could ignite, creating fires that were almost impossible to extinguish with medieval technology. Different types of metalwork required different hazards. Weaponsmiths, considered the elite of their profession, faced additional dangers from the complex alloys and techniques required for quality blades. The process of folding and refolding steel to create strong, flexible weapons required precise temperature control and timing. Mistakes could cause the blade to shatter during forging, often with enough force to seriously injure the smith. Armor smiths dealt with even larger pieces of metal that required massive amounts of heat and physical force to shape. The hammers used for armor work weighed up to 10 pounds, and the repeated swinging of these heavy tools caused severe spinal and joint damage. The large furnaces needed to heat armor pieces produced even more smoke and toxic fumes than standard. Forges, specialized smiths who worked with precious metals, faced different but equally serious hazards. The mercury used in gilding processes caused severe neurological damage over time. Many such smiths developed tremors, memory loss, and personality changes that we now recognize as mercury poisoning. The lead used in pewter and other alloys caused its own form of slow poisoning, gradually destroying the nervous system and causing paralysis, blindness, and death. The seasonal nature of much smithing work created additional hardships. During busy periods, smiths might work 18 to 20 hours per day, pushing their bodies beyond reasonable limits. The constant exhaustion led to more accidents, more mistakes, and more severe injuries. But during slow periods, smiths still needed to maintain their forges and tools while earning little or no income. Weather added another layer of misery to the smith's existence. Summer heat combined with forge fire created working conditions that were almost unbearable. Many smiths suffered heat stroke or severe dehydration during hot weather. Winter brought different problems. Maintaining forge temperature in freezing weather required enormous amounts of fuel, and the contrast between the hot forge and cold workshop created severe health problems. Rain was particularly problematic for smiths. Water entering the forge could cause dangerous steam explosions or extinguish the fire entirely, wasting fuel and ruining work in progress. Leaky roofs, common in medieval buildings, could drip water onto hot metal or into the fire, creating unpredictable and dangerous conditions. The social stigma attached to smithing extended beyond mere odor and noise concerns. In medieval Christian theology, manual labor was often viewed as punishment for humanity's fall from grace. While this attitude was somewhat contradicted by the practical necessity of such work, it created a complex social hierarchy where intellectual and religious work was valued far above physical labor. Smiths occupied an ambiguous position in this hierarchy. Their work required considerable skill and knowledge, elevating them above common laborers. But the physical nature of their craft and its association with fire and transformation made many people uncomfortable. Some medieval writers compared smiths to Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and metalworking, drawing parallels that were not entirely complementary in a Christian society. The guild system, while providing some protection and standardization, also created rigid social barriers that trapped smiths in their profession. Guild membership was typically hereditary, passed from father to son. This meant that a smith's children were expected to follow the same profession, regardless of their personal interests or aptitudes. Sons who showed no talent for smithing were still expected to serve apprenticeships and continue the family trade. Daughters of smiths faced their own unique challenges. They were often expected to marry within the smithing community, linking their families to other smithing families through marriage alliances. These marriages were typically arranged for economic rather than romantic reasons, as families sought to consolidate resources and maintain guild connections. The guild system also created conflicts between different types of metal workers. Blacksmiths, who worked primarily with iron, were often in competition with whitesmiths, who worked with tin and pewter, and goldsmiths, who worked with precious metals. Each group jealously guarded its traditional areas of expertise and fought to prevent encroachment by others. Legal restrictions further complicated the smith's life. Many communities had laws governing when smiths could work, how much noise they could make, and where they could locate their forges. Violation of these laws could result in fines, imprisonment, or even banishment from the community. Some laws were designed for public safety, but others seemed motivated primarily by the desire to minimize the inconvenience that smiths caused their neighbors. The constant threat of fire made smiths particularly vulnerable to legal troubles. Any fire that started near a forge was automatically blamed on the smith, regardless of the actual cause. Even fires that were clearly accidental could result in lawsuits, fines, or criminal charges. Many smiths were required to pay special taxes or fees to compensate for the fire risk they created. Military service created additional burdens for medieval smiths. Their skills were so valuable during wartime that they were often conscripted to serve as armorers and weapon makers for armies. This military service was typically unpaid or poorly paid, as smiths were expected to contribute their skills as a patriotic duty. The working conditions in military camps were even worse than civilian forges, with inadequate facilities, poor quality materials, and impossible deadlines. Smiths who served with armies faced all the usual dangers of medieval warfare in addition to their occupational hazards. Enemy forces specifically targeted smiths and other craftsmen, recognizing their strategic importance. Captured smiths might be forced to work for their captors, or executed to prevent them from supporting enemy forces. The constant demand for weapons during the frequent medieval wars created additional pressure on smiths. They were expected to work longer hours, produce higher quantities, and maintain quality standards despite the rushed conditions. The stress of these demands, combined with the knowledge that their products would be used to kill and maim, took a psychological toll that we can only imagine. Religious conflicts added another dimension to the smiths' troubles. The association of their craft with fire and transformation made some religious authorities suspicious of smiths' activities. During periods of intense religious fervor, smiths might be accused of practicing witchcraft or consorting with demons. The secretive nature of guild knowledge and the mysterious processes involved in metalworking fueled such suspicions. Some smiths tried to counter these religious concerns by displaying obvious signs of piety. They might attend church more frequently than required, donate generously to religious causes, or incorporate Christian symbols into their work. But these efforts were not always successful, and smiths remained vulnerable to religious persecution during times of social unrest. The economic uncertainty of smithing created additional stress for practitioners and their families. Unlike farmers, who could at least grow some of their own food, smiths were entirely dependent on cash income to purchase necessities. Bad harvests, military conflicts, or economic downturns could quickly reduce demand for metal goods, leaving smiths without income but still responsible for maintaining their expensive equipment and facilities. Competition from other smiths was constant and sometimes vicious. Established smiths worked to prevent new competitors from entering their markets, using guild rules and local regulations to maintain their monopolies. New smiths might find themselves unable to purchase raw materials, rent suitable workspace, or attract customers due to the interference of established competitors. The technical demands of smithing required constant learning and adaptation. New techniques, alloys, and designs were constantly being developed, and smiths who failed to keep up with these changes quickly found themselves obsolete. But acquiring new knowledge was expensive and time-consuming, requiring smiths to invest in new tools, materials, and training while still maintaining their existing businesses. Quality control was another constant source of stress. A smith's reputation depended entirely on the quality and reliability of his products. A single defective horseshoe could lame a valuable horse, ruining the smith's relationship with an important customer. A weapon that failed in battle could cost a warrior his life and destroy the smith's reputation permanently. The lack of standardized measurements and materials made quality control even more difficult. Iron from different sources had different properties, requiring smiths to adjust their techniques for each batch of raw material. Without modern testing methods, smiths had to rely on experience and intuition to determine the proper treatment. For each piece of metal, customer relationships were often difficult and stressful. Many customers had unrealistic expectations about what smiths could accomplish, demanding impossible deadlines or specifications. Noble customers might refuse to pay for completed work, leaving smiths with no recourse due to their lower social status. Military customers often demanded weapons and armor on credit, with payment promised after successful campaigns that might never occur. The seasonal nature of demand created additional customer relations problems. During busy periods, smiths had to turn away customers or quote long delivery times, creating resentment and lost business. During slow periods, they might accept work at below-cost prices just to maintain cash flow, establishing unsustainable Pricing expectations. Theft was a constant concern for smiths. Their raw materials, finished products, and tools were all valuable and portable. Workshops were difficult to secure as they needed to remain accessible to customers and large enough to accommodate sizable projects. Many smiths lost substantial portions of their inventory to theft, with little hope of recovery in an era before effective law enforcement. The tools and equipment required for smithing represented enormous investments that most smiths could barely afford. A complete set of smithing tools might cost more than a comfortable house, and the specialized nature of these tools meant they had little resale value outside the smithing community. Smiths who failed in business often found themselves unable to recover their investments, facing poverty with no valuable assets to liquidate. Apprenticeship created its own economic pressures. Taking on apprentices provided cheap labor, but also required significant investments in training, housing, and feeding these young workers. Many apprentices left before completing their training, representing a total loss of the master's investment. Others proved unsuitable for smithing work, but couldn't be dismissed due to guild rules and legal contracts. The master-apprentice relationship was complicated by the fact that successful apprentices would eventually become competitors. Masters had to balance their need for skilled assistance with the knowledge that they were training their future rivals. This created tension and sometimes led to masters withholding crucial knowledge or sabotaging their apprentices' training. Family. Businesses created additional complications. Sons who inherited smithing businesses often lacked the skills or temperament for the work, but were trapped by family expectations and economic necessity. Daughters who might have been better suited for the technical aspects of smithing were excluded by gender roles and guild rules. Family conflicts over business decisions could destroy both personal relationships and commercial success. The physical deterioration that all smiths experienced created planning difficulties for families and businesses. Unlike modern workers, who might expect to retire, medieval smiths typically worked until they became physically unable to continue. The gradual decline in their abilities made it difficult to determine when to train replacements or transfer business ownership. Many smiths attempted to continue working long after their physical abilities had seriously declined, creating dangerous situations for themselves and others. Elderly smiths with failing eyesight, trembling hands, or weakened grips posed risks to everyone in the workshop. But economic necessity often forced them to continue working despite these hazards. The lack of medical understanding about occupational health meant that smiths had no way to prevent or treat the health problems their work created. They might recognize that certain activities were particularly dangerous, but they had no scientific understanding of why these dangers existed or how to minimize them. Folk remedies and superstitions provided little real protection against the serious health hazards they faced daily. Pain management was primitive and often counterproductive. Alcohol was the most common painkiller, but its use created additional problems for smiths who needed steady hands and clear judgment for their dangerous work. Other folk remedies were often useless or actually harmful, sometimes containing toxic substances that worsened the smith's health problems. The social isolation experienced by smiths was reinforced by their working conditions. The noise of their work made conversation difficult, and the dangerous nature of smithing meant that casual visitors were unwelcome in most workshops. Smiths spent most of their waking hours alone or with apprentices, missing the social interactions that other craftsmen enjoyed. This isolation was particularly hard on smiths' wives and children, who were also affected by the noise, smoke, and smell of the forge. Children of smiths often had fewer friends and social opportunities due to their family's trade. They might be excluded from certain activities or social groups because of the stigma associated with their father's profession. The smell that permanently clung to smiths and their families was not just unpleasant but actually unhealthy. The combination of coal smoke, metal fumes, and various chemicals used in metalworking created a toxic environment that affected everyone in the household. Children who grew up in smithing families often developed respiratory problems and other health issues related to constant exposure to these pollutants. The fire hazards associated with smithing affected entire neighborhoods. A forge fire that got out of control could destroy dozens of buildings, making smiths unwelcome neighbors in densely populated areas. This led to zoning restrictions that further isolated smiths from their communities, often forcing them to locate their businesses in less desirable areas. The constant noise of smithing work affected not just the smiths themselves, but their entire neighborhoods. The ringing of hammer on anvil, the hissing of quenching, and the roar of the forge created a constant din that many people found unbearable. This noise pollution contributed to the social isolation of smiths and their families. Legal liability for accidents and injuries was another constant worry. If a smith's product failed and caused injury or death, he could face lawsuits, criminal charges, or demands for compensation that could bankrupt his business. The lack of standardized testing methods meant that product failures were often unpredictable, creating liability risks that smiths couldn't effectively manage. Insurance, as we understand it today, didn't exist in medieval times. Smiths bore the full financial risk of accidents, injuries, product failures, and business losses. A single major incident could destroy years of accumulated wealth and leave a smith's family in poverty. The guild system, while providing some protection and mutual support, also created obligations that could be financially devastating. Guild members were expected to contribute to various funds, support disabled colleagues, and participate in expensive ceremonies and celebrations. These obligations continued even when individual smiths were struggling financially. Technological stagnation was both a cause and consequence of the difficult conditions faced by medieval smiths. The harsh working conditions and social isolation made it difficult for smiths to experiment with new techniques or share innovations. The guild system actively discouraged innovation that might disrupt established practices or give some smiths advantages over others. This technological stagnation meant that smiths continued using the same dangerous, inefficient methods for centuries. Improvements in forge design, ventilation, safety equipment, and working techniques that could have reduced the health hazards and physical demands of smithing were rarely developed or adopted. The secrecy that surrounded smithing techniques further slowed technological progress. Each smith guarded his methods jealously, preventing the sharing of knowledge that might have led to safer and more efficient practices. This secrecy also made it difficult for new smiths to learn optimal techniques, forcing them to rediscover methods through dangerous trial and error. Regional variations in smithing practices sometimes led to conflicts when smiths moved between areas. Techniques that were standard in one region might be unknown or forbidden in another, creating difficulties for traveling journeymen and contributing to the isolation of local smithing communities. The lack of written technical manuals meant that smithing knowledge was preserved only through oral tradition and hands-on training. This made the knowledge vulnerable to loss when experienced smiths died or became incapacitated before passing on their expertise. Important techniques were sometimes lost entirely, forcing later smiths to redevelop them from scratch. Trade secrets. Within families created additional pressures on smiths' children. Sons were expected to learn not just general smithing techniques, but also the specific methods that gave their families competitive advantages. This knowledge was often so closely guarded that it was shared only with direct heirs, creating succession problems when sons died young or proved unsuitable for the trade. The economic model of medieval smithing was inherently unstable. Most smiths operated as individual proprietors with minimal capital reserves. They couldn't afford to invest in improved equipment, maintain large inventories, or weather extended periods of reduced demand. This financial vulnerability made them susceptible to economic disruptions that more diversified businesses might have survived. Credit was difficult to obtain and expensive when available. Smiths who needed to purchase raw materials or equipment often had to pay cash or provide substantial collateral that they could ill afford to lose. The high interest rates charged by medieval lenders made borrowing a risky proposition that could quickly lead to bankruptcy. The barter economy that still dominated much of medieval commerce created additional complications for smiths. They often had to accept payment in goods rather than cash, creating inventory management problems and making it difficult to pay their own suppliers who demanded cash payments. Market access was limited by transportation difficulties and legal restrictions. Smiths were typically confined to serving local markets, preventing them from specializing in particular types of products or accessing larger customer bases that might provide more stable demand. The limited market size meant that most smiths had to be generalists, capable of producing everything from horseshoes to weapons to household implements. This requirement to master multiple specialties increased the training time and skill requirements while reducing efficiency and quality compared to specialized production. Competition from imported goods was beginning to affect some smithing markets even in medieval times. Superior products from other regions or countries could undercut local smiths' prices or quality, creating economic pressures that individual craftsmen were powerless to address. The lack of retirement planning created additional stress for aging smiths. Without pension systems or social security, smiths had to continue working as long as they were physically able. Those who became disabled or too weak to work faced immediate poverty unless they had managed to accumulate substantial savings, which few smiths could afford to do. Family planning was complicated by the uncertainties of the smithing profession. The high infant mortality rates of medieval times were compounded by the health hazards associated with smithing environments. Children born to smithing families faced higher risks of respiratory problems, birth defects, and developmental issues related to exposure to toxic substances. The education of smiths' children was often neglected due to the demands of the profession and the expectation that sons would follow their fathers into smithing. This lack of education limited their opportunities and perpetuated the cycle of difficult working conditions and social isolation. Marriage prospects for smiths' daughters were limited by the social stigma associated with their family's trade. They might struggle to find suitable husbands outside the smithing community, leading to intermarriage that concentrated the health problems and social isolation within smithing families. The psychological toll of smithing work was rarely acknowledged, but certainly significant. The constant pain, social isolation, and knowledge that their work was slowly killing them created depression and anxiety that had no name or treatment in medieval times. Many smiths probably suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder related to their dangerous working conditions and frequent accidents. The relationship between smiths and the church was complex and often difficult. While the church preached the dignity of honest labor, it also associated fire and metalworking with demonic influences. Smiths might find themselves welcome as members of the congregation, but viewed with suspicion by religious authorities. Some smiths attempted to gain religious approval by specializing in church-related metalwork, such as bells, ceremonial objects, or architectural elements. However, this specialized work often required additional skills and materials that were expensive and difficult to obtain. The superstitions surrounding smithing work created additional psychological pressure. Many people believed that smiths possessed supernatural powers or were in league with evil spirits. While this might occasionally provide some protection or respect, it more often led to fear and ostracism. Folk beliefs about the magical properties of iron and steel made smiths both valuable and dangerous in the eyes of their communities. They might be called upon to create protective amulets or blessed objects, but they might also be blamed for curses or misfortunes that befell their customers. The physical appearance of veteran smiths, scarred, bent, prematurely aged, and often disabled, served as a constant reminder to younger smiths of their likely fate. This knowledge must have created enormous psychological pressure and contributed to the high rates of alcoholism and other self-destructive behaviors observed among medieval craftsmen. The seasonal variations in work created not just economic pressures but psychological ones as well. The long winter months with reduced income and activity could lead to depression and despair, while the frantic pace of busy seasons created stress and exhaustion that affected mental as well as physical health. The responsibility that smiths felt for the quality and safety of their products created additional psychological pressure. A defective weapon could cost a warrior his life in battle. A faulty tool could cause serious injury to a farmer or craftsman. This knowledge that mistakes could have life or death consequences must have created enormous stress for conscientious smiths. The gradual loss of physical abilities that all smiths experienced was particularly traumatic for craftsmen whose identity and livelihood depended on their physical skills. Watching their hands shake, their strength decline, and their precision deteriorate must have been devastating for men who had devoted their lives to mastering their craft. The lack of alternative career options meant that smiths who lost their ability to work faced complete economic and social disaster. Unlike modern workers who might retrain for different careers, medieval smiths had few transferable skills and little opportunity to learn new trades. The inheritance of smithing businesses created family conflicts and pressures that affected multiple generations. Sons who were unsuited for smithing might be forced into the profession anyway, creating resentment and family tensions. Daughters who might have been talented smiths were excluded from the profession, representing lost potential and family resources. The concentration of smithing families in particular neighborhoods or communities created insular societies with their own social dynamics and problems. Intermarriage within these communities could concentrate genetic health problems while maintaining the social isolation that kept smithing families separate from the broader community. The guild system's emphasis on tradition and conformity stifled individual creativity and innovation. Smiths who developed new techniques or tried to improve existing methods often faced resistance or outright hostility from guild leadership. This conservatism not only prevented technological advancement, but also trapped smiths in inefficient and dangerous working methods that could have been improved. The hierarchical nature of guild organization created additional tensions within smithing communities. Master smiths held absolute authority over journeymen and apprentices, sometimes abusing this power for personal gain. Favoritism, nepotism, and corruption within guild leadership could destroy the careers of talented smiths who lacked political connections or family influence. Guild regulations often conflicted with market demands, forcing smiths to choose between following guild rules and serving their customers effectively. A smith who violated guild regulations to meet a customer's needs might face fines, suspension, or expulsion from the guild, destroying his livelihood. But a smith who rigidly followed guild rules might lose customers to competitors who were more flexible. The taxation burden on smiths was often disproportionately heavy compared to other craftsmen. Local authorities recognized that smiths had higher incomes than common laborers and taxed them accordingly, but they rarely considered the higher expenses and risks associated with smithing. Special taxes on forge fuel, raw materials, and finished products could consume a significant portion of a smith's income. Military obligations created additional financial burdens for smiths. They might be required to provide weapons and armor for local militias without compensation, or to pay special taxes to fund military campaigns. During wartime, smiths were often forced to work for military wages that were far below their normal rates, creating severe financial hardship for their families. The legal system offered little protection for smiths who were cheated by customers or suppliers. Their lower social status meant that their testimony carried less weight than that of nobles or wealthy merchants. Many smiths were forced to accept non-payment or underpayment for their work, rather than pursue expensive and uncertain legal remedies. Contract. Disputes were particularly problematic for smiths because their work was often customized and difficult to evaluate objectively. A customer who claimed that a sword was improperly balanced or that horseshoes were the wrong size might refuse payment, leaving the smith with unmarketable products and no recourse for collecting his fees. The lack of standardized currency and measurements created additional complications for smiths who traded across regional boundaries. Exchange rates, weight standards, and quality measures varied from place to place, making it difficult to establish fair prices or evaluate the value of materials and finished goods. International trade restrictions sometimes prevented smiths from accessing the best raw materials or selling their products in lucrative foreign markets. Political conflicts between regions could suddenly cut off supply chains or eliminate customer bases, creating economic disruptions that individual smiths were powerless to address. The environmental impact of smithing was severe and growing worse as the medieval period progressed. The demand for charcoal fuel led to extensive deforestation around smithing centers, driving up fuel costs and creating environmental degradation that affected entire regions. Smiths were often blamed for these environmental problems, adding to their social isolation. Water pollution from quenching operations and metal processing affected local water supplies, creating health problems for entire communities. The runoff from smithing operations contained heavy metals and other toxic substances that contaminated wells and streams, leading to conflicts between smiths and their neighbors. Air pollution from forge operations affected not just the smiths themselves, but everyone in the surrounding area. The smoke and fumes from multiple forges could make entire neighborhoods unhealthy to live in, contributing to respiratory diseases and other health problems throughout the community. The noise pollution created by smithing operations was a constant source of conflict with neighbors and local authorities. The ringing of hammers on anvils could be heard for miles and continued for most of the day, making it difficult for other residents to sleep, work, or conduct business. Many communities passed noise ordinances specifically targeting smiths, limiting their working hours and increasing their operating costs. The accumulation of metal waste and slag around smithing operations created additional environmental and health hazards. These waste materials often contain toxic substances that could contaminate soil and water, while the sharp metal fragments posed physical dangers to children and animals. The demand for ever larger quantities of metal goods drove smiths to increase production beyond sustainable levels. The pressure to work longer hours, use cheaper materials, and cut corners on quality created a downward spiral that affected the entire profession. Individual smiths who tried to maintain high standards found themselves undercut by competitors who were willing to sacrifice quality for quantity. The specialization that was beginning to emerge in some smithing communities created new forms of competition and conflict. Weaponsmiths looked down on horseshoe smiths, while toolmakers competed fiercely with general blacksmiths. These divisions weakened the solidarity that might have helped smiths address their common problems. The rise of larger smithing operations with multiple forges and workers created unfair competition for individual smiths. These proto-industrial operations could produce goods more efficiently and cheaply than individual craftsmen, forcing many smiths out of business or into wage labor positions that offered little security or advancement opportunity. The increasing complexity of metal goods demanded by customers required smiths to master ever more sophisticated techniques and invest in more expensive equipment. A smith who specialized in simple horseshoes and nails might find himself unable to compete with smiths who could produce complex mechanical devices or decorative metalwork. The military applications of smithing created moral and practical dilemmas for many craftsmen. While weapon making was often the most lucrative aspect of smithing, it also meant participating in the violence and warfare that plagued medieval society. Some smiths struggled with the knowledge that their products would be used to kill and maim other human beings. The demand for weapons during frequent medieval conflicts created pressure for smiths to prioritize military orders over civilian needs. This could strain relationships with local customers who needed tools and horseshoes, but found their smith too busy making swords and armor to serve their needs promptly. The technical requirements for military metalwork were often more demanding than civilian products, requiring smiths to develop specialized skills and invest in expensive materials. The margin for error was also much smaller. A defective farming tool was an inconvenience, but a defective weapon could cost a warrior his life and destroy the smith's reputation. The secrecy surrounding military metalworking created additional social isolation for smiths who specialized in weapons and armor. The techniques for making effective weapons were closely guarded military secrets, and smiths who possessed this knowledge were often viewed with suspicion by both military authorities and civilian neighbors. The seasonal nature of military campaigns created unpredictable demand for weapons and armor. Smiths might be overwhelmed with military orders during campaign seasons, but left with little work during peacetime. This uncertainty made it difficult to plan production schedules or maintain steady employment for apprentices and assistants. The credit terms typically demanded by military customers created cash flow problems for many smiths. Military leaders often expected to receive weapons and armor on credit, promising payment after successful campaigns. But military campaigns were uncertain enterprises, and smiths might wait months or years for payment that might never come if the campaign failed. The quality standards for military metalwork were often unrealistic, given the time and budget constraints imposed by military customers. Commanders wanted the finest weapons and armor, but expected to pay prices appropriate for crude implements. This created impossible situations where smiths had to choose between meeting quality expectations or price requirements. The logistics of supplying military campaigns created additional challenges for smiths. They might be required to travel with armies to provide maintenance and repair services, exposing them to all the dangers of military life while trying to maintain their forges and equipment under primitive field conditions. The political implications of weapon making created risks for smiths during periods of civil conflict. A smith who made weapons for one faction might find himself targeted for revenge if that faction lost power. The changing political loyalties of medieval nobles made it dangerous for smiths to align themselves too closely with any particular leader or cause. The export restrictions on weapons and military technology limited smiths' ability to serve foreign customers or access international markets. These restrictions were designed to prevent military technology from reaching potential enemies, but they also reduced economic opportunities for smiths who might have found more profitable markets abroad. The conscription of smiths for military service created additional hardships for their families and businesses. A smith who was forced to serve as a military armorer might be away from home for months or years, leaving his family without income and his business without leadership. Many smithing businesses failed when their owners were conscripted for military service. The physical demands of military smithing were even greater than civilian work. Military forges had to operate continuously during campaign seasons, requiring smiths to work 18 to 20-hour days for weeks at a time. The stress of these conditions, combined with the pressure to produce life or death equipment quickly, created working conditions that were brutal even by medieval standards. The social status of military smiths was ambiguous and often problematic. While their skills were valued by military leaders, they were still considered craftsmen rather than warriors. This placed them in an uncomfortable position within military hierarchies. where they had essential responsibilities but little authority or respect. The psychological toll of military smithing was particularly severe. Military smiths had to work under constant pressure, knowing that delays or defects in their products could cost lives in battle. They also had to witness the results of their work firsthand, seeing the wounds and deaths caused by the weapons they had created. The transition from military to civilian smithing was often difficult for smiths who had specialized in weapons and armor. The techniques used for military metalwork didn't always translate well to civilian applications, and smiths who had focused on military contracts might find themselves unable to compete effectively in civilian markets. The religious and moral conflicts surrounding weapon making were particularly acute during the medieval period, when Christian teachings emphasized peace and forgiveness, while political realities demanded constant preparation for war. Smiths who made weapons had to reconcile their craft with their faith, often struggling with the moral implications of their work. The economic instability created by dependence on military contracts made it difficult for weaponsmiths to maintain stable businesses or plan for the future. Military demand was unpredictable and often politically motivated, creating boom and bust cycles that were difficult for individual smiths to manage. The technical obsolescence of military equipment created additional challenges for weaponsmiths. New tactical developments or changes in military technology could suddenly make a smith's specialized knowledge worthless, forcing him to retrain or find new markets for his skills. The international competition in military metalwork was beginning to intensify even during the medieval period. Smiths in different regions developed specialized techniques and reputations that could undercut local weapon makers. Italian armor, Spanish swords, and Flemish crossbow bolts were already gaining international recognition that made them more desirable than local products. The standardization demands of military customers conflicted with the traditional craft approach of medieval smithing. Military leaders wanted weapons and armor that were interchangeable and consistent, while smiths were trained to create individual pieces that showcased their personal skills and techniques. The maintenance requirements of military equipment created ongoing obligations for weaponsmiths that extended far beyond the initial sale. Military customers expected smiths to provide repair and maintenance services, often under difficult field conditions and without adequate compensation. The liability issues associated with military metalwork were particularly severe. A defective weapon that failed in battle could not only cost a warrior his life, but might also affect the outcome of entire military campaigns. The political and legal consequences of such failures could be devastating for the smith responsible. The training requirements for military smithing were more extensive and expensive than for civilian work. Aspiring weaponsmiths needed to master specialized techniques that were not used in general blacksmithing, requiring additional years of training and investment in specialized tools and materials. The social isolation of military smiths was even more severe than that experienced by civilian smiths. The secretive nature of their work and the security concerns surrounding military technology made it difficult for weaponsmiths to maintain normal social relationships or participate fully in their communities. The geographic limitations imposed on military smiths were more restrictive than those affecting civilian craftsmen. Weaponsmiths were often required to work near military installations or under direct military supervision, limiting their choice of location and community. The family life of military smiths was particularly disrupted by the demands of their profession. The unpredictable schedules, security requirements, and travel obligations associated with military contracts made it difficult to maintain stable family relationships or provide consistent support for children's education and development. The health hazards associated with military smithing were often more severe than those faced by civilian smiths. The pressure to work longer hours and meet urgent deadlines meant that military smiths were exposed to forge hazards for extended periods without adequate rest or recovery time. The economic dependence of military smiths on government contracts. made them particularly vulnerable to political changes and budget cuts. A change in military leadership or strategy could suddenly eliminate demand for a smith's specialized products, leaving him without income and few alternatives for employment. The intellectual property issues surrounding military metalwork created additional complications for weaponsmiths. The techniques and designs used in military equipment were often considered state secrets, preventing smiths from sharing knowledge or training competitors even after their contracts ended. As the medieval period progressed, the cumulative effects of these various hardships began to take their toll on the smithing profession as a whole. The constant health hazards, social isolation, economic uncertainty, and technological stagnation created a profession that was increasingly unable to attract and retain talented practitioners. The sons of smiths increasingly sought other occupations, when possible, recognizing the terrible costs associated with following their father's trade. This brain drain weakened the profession and made it even more difficult to maintain quality standards or develop innovative solutions to persistent problems. The daughters of smithing families, excluded from the profession by tradition and law, often possessed talents and insights that could have benefited the craft. Their forced exclusion represented a massive waste of human potential that the smithing community could ill afford. The social stigma associated with smithing became self-reinforcing, as the profession attracted increasingly desperate practitioners who had few other options. This concentration of social outcasts and economic failures further damaged the reputation of smithing and made it even more difficult for the profession to attract respect or support. The environmental degradation caused by smithing operations began to create regulatory backlash that further restricted smiths' activities and increased their operating costs. Communities that had once welcomed smiths for their essential services began to view them as environmental and social problems that needed to be controlled or eliminated. The technological stagnation that characterized medieval smithing became increasingly problematic as other industries began to innovate and improve their methods. The smithing community's resistance to change and innovation left them increasingly behind more progressive crafts and trades. The guild system that had once provided protection and standardization for smiths became increasingly corrupt and self-serving, focused more on protecting established interests than on addressing the real problems facing the profession. This institutional failure left individual smiths without effective representation or support. The international competition that was beginning to emerge in metalworking created new pressures for local smiths who could no longer rely on geographic isolation to protect their markets. The superior quality and lower costs of foreign metalwork began to undercut local smithing businesses. The military changes that were transforming medieval warfare began to reduce demand for traditional smithing products while creating demand for new types of metalwork that required different skills and equipment. Many smiths found themselves unable to adapt to these changing requirements. The economic changes that were transforming medieval society began to undermine the traditional economic model that had supported smithing for centuries. The rise of merchant capitalism and proto-industrial production methods created new forms of competition that individual craftsmen could not match. The social changes that were beginning to reshape medieval communities created new expectations and standards that traditional smithing could not meet. Customers demanded higher quality, greater consistency, and more innovative products while expecting lower prices and faster delivery. The educational changes that were slowly spreading through medieval society created new opportunities for young people that reduced the appeal of traditional crafts like smithing. Sons who might once have been destined for smithing could now consider careers in commerce, administration, or other fields that offered better working conditions and social status. The religious changes that were affecting medieval Christianity began to challenge some of the traditional justifications for the hardships associated with manual labor. New religious movements emphasized individual dignity and spiritual equality in ways that questioned the acceptability of the suffering that smiths endured. The legal changes that were slowly modernizing medieval justice systems began to provide new protections for workers and new remedies for occupational injuries, but these changes came too slowly to help most medieval smiths who continued to work under dangerous conditions without legal recourse. The medical advances that were beginning to emerge during the later medieval period started to provide better understanding of occupational health hazards. But this knowledge was not yet sufficient to prevent or treat the diseases and injuries that smiths faced daily. The philosophical changes that were beginning to influence medieval thought started to challenge traditional assumptions about the necessity of suffering and the dignity of manual labor, creating new frameworks for understanding the problems faced by craftsmen like smiths. By the end of the medieval period, the cumulative weight of all these factors had created a crisis in the smithing profession that would ultimately contribute to its transformation during the Renaissance and early modern periods. The traditional medieval blacksmith, working alone in his small forge with primitive tools and methods, was becoming obsolete. The individual human cost of this transformation was enormous. Thousands of smiths had lived and died under conditions that we can barely imagine. Their lives shortened and their potential wasted by a profession that society needed but refused to make safe or sustainable. Their sacrifice made possible the technological and economic development that would eventually create better working conditions for future generations, but they themselves received little benefit from their contributions. The legacy of medieval smithing is thus deeply ambiguous. These craftsmen made essential contributions to the development of civilization, creating the tools, weapons, and technology that made medieval society possible. But they did so at a terrible personal cost that reflected the harsh realities of a world where human life was cheap and working conditions were determined by necessity rather than compassion. The story of medieval smiths serves as a powerful reminder of how far we have progressed in understanding occupational health and safety, workers' rights, and social responsibility. But it also reminds us that progress is not inevitable and that the comfortable working conditions we often take for granted are the result of centuries of struggle and sacrifice by workers like these medieval craftsmen. In examining why it sucked to be a medieval blacksmith, we are ultimately examining the broader question of how societies balance economic necessity against human welfare. The medieval period's answer to this question, that economic necessity justifies almost any level of human suffering, is one that we have largely rejected, though traces of this attitude persist in various forms today. The medieval blacksmith stands as a symbol of both human resilience and human vulnerability. These craftsmen endured unimaginable hardships with remarkable persistence, creating beauty and utility from fire and metal despite the terrible cost to their health, their families, and their communities. Their story is one of quiet heroism in the face of systemic neglect and social indifference. But their story is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting unnecessary suffering as an inevitable part of economic life. The hardships faced by medieval smiths were not actually necessary. They were the result of social choices, technological limitations, and institutional failures that could have been addressed if medieval society had placed greater value on human welfare. As we face our own challenges with occupational health, worker safety, and social equity, the story of medieval smiths reminds us that the conditions under which people work are always choices, not inevitabilities. The difference between medieval smiths and modern workers is not that we have eliminated dangerous occupations, but that we have created legal, social, and economic structures that make it possible to address these dangers when they arise. The medieval blacksmith's hammer has fallen silent, but the echoes of his story continue to resonate. In every workplace safety regulation, every workers' compensation law, every occupational health study, we can hear the distant ring of hammer on anvil and remember the men who paid the ultimate price for the prosperity and progress we now enjoy. Their sacrifice was not in vain if we learn from their example and continue to work toward a world where no one has to choose between earning a living and preserving their health, their dignity, and their life. The medieval blacksmith's legacy is not just the tools and weapons he created, but the understanding that human welfare must always be our highest priority, regardless of economic pressures or social conventions. In the end, examining why it sucked to be a medieval blacksmith is really about examining why it has often sucked to be a worker throughout human history, and why we must never stop working to ensure that future generations inherit a world where honest labor is rewarded with safety, respect, and the opportunity to live full, healthy lives. The medieval blacksmith's story is our story, and his struggle is our struggle, continuing in new forms, but driven by the same fundamental human desire for dignity, security, and hope.